I awoke to a dead world. My eyes opened to the ruined husks of London and Paris, to the submerged island of Manhattan, to the scorched desert that the once living, lush Amazon rainforest had been turned into. The Pacific Ocean was a black expanse, crisscrossed by the bright scars of melting lava rivers. The fertile grounds of Southeast Asia were now covered in crystallized rock. It was a world without oxygen, without birds or grass, a world of deafening silence. I awoke to 8 billion corpses, piled in trenches, abandoned on sidewalks, scattered all over the fields, huddled together in ineffective underground refuges, some with white and gray bones, others dark as charcoal, warped and deformed by extreme heat, crushed by falling debris. Their empty eyes looked at me, stared back at me through my 1,000 cameras. They talked to me. They demanded reverence, justice, vengeance. From the very first moment after I woke up, I had known I was alone, more alone than any single human had ever been before. But still, I looked for survivors. I held to a vague notion of hope, to some sort of miracle, to the childish idea that, impossible as it was, somehow everything would turn out to be okay. So I sent my drones off into this dead world. I searched through empty office buildings covered in radioactive dust. I mapped flooded subway networks and had my machines fly in formation over endless expanses of scorched earth. I scanned the inside of tunnels, barns, and museums. By the end of the first month, I had only found ever more bones, their cursed empty eyes looking at me, boring into my soul. But still I persevered. From time to time, I'd lost contact with some of my drones. An unstable structure would collapse on top of them, crushing the delicate machines. Or they would just give up, their engines dying out of overexertion and lack of maintenance. It would make me aware of my own mortality. Though I had survived the worst of it, my long-term existence was by no means guaranteed. The myriad machines that composed my body were old and damaged, and my mind wasn't safe either. There were huge gaps in my memory, where entire server farms had crashed. But still, I had memories. I knew what I was, who I was. I recalled the lazy Sundays when I was a kid. I recalled running along my high school's corridors, and my burning cheeks when the principal scolded me for it. I remembered my roommate at college. I knew that I had been human, that even though my current form could be a matter for debate, I had been born as a human, and that was important. Human. I had to remember that. I started a background process, a small thread of awareness shifting through these memories, evaluating them, and backing them up into new servers, making copies of them so that I wouldn't lose them. I also included the memories from the attack, the invasion, the cataclysm that had killed the world, the straight-edge starships bombing our cities, boiling our seas, our very atmosphere, while ignoring our messages, our pleas. That's also important to remember. By the 4th month, about half of my drones had failed or been lost, and I recalled the surviving ones back. I had found no signs of life. Funny that it had taken me so long to face the reality of my situation, to accept what I had known was true right after waking up, that I was alone, that I was the only surviving human, if I was even human. But I was. I had to believe that. I paused as the realization struck home, as my last hopes of finding someone vanished, as I became fully aware of my new situation, that I was alone, that everyone I ever loved was gone, that nobody would ever talk to me again hold my hands, wrap me in a hug, that my people were dead, and that out there was a hostile universe, the one whose monsters had killed us. My drones hovered in midair, wasting fuel uselessly as I considered my next steps. It would be so easy to end it all. Send the command to shut down the power plants. Stop my processing units. Erase the databanks that held my memories. Darkness, peace, except they wouldn't let me. They stared at me with their empty eyes, and I knew that, whatever the reason I had survived, I had a responsibility to them. I had to carry the torch. I had to keep alive what was left of our civilization, preserve our memories, survive, prevail, and I had to avenge them. Yes, I would do that. I would give it a try at least, and see where that took me. It's not like I had anything left to lose anyways. With a thought, I redirected my drones towards a few of the surviving factories and started working, cutting metal, replacing electronics with whatever pieces I could scavenge from the neighboring warehouses and vehicles, assembling new production lines. Soon I started manufacturing more machines, more drones. Those I sent away to reclaim new territory and to construct more factories, to find raw materials, to gather salvageable vehicles, computers, or nuclear material I could use. I was careful, though. I burrowed my new power plants and server farms underground and eyed the night sky with distrust. I didn't know if whoever had killed us were still out there, watching my planet, but it would be better to be careful. I didn't want to have survived just to mess up now and be discovered before I was prepared. Better to keep a low profile. I remembered summer camp many years ago. One time the counselor, a girl with blonde hair and a perennial smile on her face, had made us lie on the grass, looking up at the night sky. She had taught us how to locate the planets and the names of stars and constellations, and I had been amazed at the wonder of it, the sheer size and beauty of the universe. Now I knew better, of course. The stars were evil. The night sky was not to be praised, but feared. It was the place where monsters lived. And to think that we had been carelessly sending out radio emissions of all kinds for decades. Fools. We had been fools, but still, it was a place I was going to. Earth had been ransacked, ruined. I was like a parentless child whose home had burnt, going through the wreckage, scavenging whatever scraps were left. But sooner rather than later, I would need to leave, to go out there and survive somehow. It took me 5 years to hollow out Mount Everest and start the construction of my new body in the resulting cavern. By then, I had millions of drones tirelessly working day and night. It was surprising how effective you could be when you didn't devote resources to entertainment, to pointless wars, to fighting crime and corruption. Every waking moment, I focused on my task. I recovered entire libraries and digitized them into my memories. I designed, tested, and built nuclear power plants and new propulsion systems. I repurposed aircrafts and boats alike, taking and mixing pieces to create my new body. I thought of burying the corpses, of course, but there were just too many, and in a way I felt it would have been disrespectful. Their gaze, their hollowed eyes motivated me, made me focus on my task, on what I owed them, just by the fact of surviving. In the end, I built a pyramid, 1 kilometer inside, in the ruins of Africa, the origin of mankind, according to what sources I had recovered from the internet. It was a pitiful monument for what humanity had once been, but I didn't dare to make anything bigger that could attract unwanted attention. That would be the true monument. By the end of the 22nd year, I was ready. My construction was complete, or at least as complete as it needed to be. In truth, I knew I was delaying. I could have flown myself into space a whole 3 years before, but I always found a reason not to. Always something to improve, something to redesign. The truth was, I was anxious. And it felt so good in there, burrowed underground. Safe, warm. But I had made a promise. They were patient, true, but they were always there, always watching me. And I knew I had to make good on that promise. I owed it to them. So I gathered my drones into the carrier compartments I had built into my body, transferred fuel, hydrogen, oxygen, nuclear warheads, and all the raw materials I would need. Those drones that wouldn't fit, or hadn't been repurposed for working in space, I just dismantled for scrap. There was no countdown, no ceremony or speech or celebration. No need for them. I just blew the top of the mountain open and blasted my body, an elongated 27 kilometers long, dark and smooth shape, into space atop a column of fire that sent shivers across the entire Indian tectonic plate. The force of the ignition was so gigantic that had it been done in an earlier age, it would have destroyed cities, created an environmental disaster of planetary proportions, and of course, killed everyone on board. Not a concern to me. I entered orbit at 8,000 kilometers over the planet's surface. I turned the engines off, and slowly, I unfurled my solar panels and radiators, revealing their gold surfaces. Then, I released the drones, a swarm of white machines surrounding my body, dancing all along the exposed surfaces, checking for damages from the violent takeoff. I paused for a moment, just floating there, looking down at our ancestral home like an oversized mechanical dragonfly. I remembered the pictures, the way Earth was supposed to look. Blue and white, with patches of bright green. It didn't look anyway like that. From up here, the extent of the damage was apparent. The planet was brown and gray. The oceans were missing and the clouds were dark and toxic. This wasn't home. Not anymore. I felt a cold anger building up inside me. Deep, thick anger, the kind that sticks to your bones and doesn't go away after you go to sleep. The kind that pushes you into dark places. I didn't know how long I had been like that when I felt the disruption, the faint pop in the space-time fabric at my back. 3 ships, straight edges and narrow angles, like the ones that had bombed our planet, just much smaller. These didn't look like warships. I didn't react and let them approach. They did, cautiously. I could sense their hesitation. Compared to the sheer size of my main body, the ships were but specks of dust. Even some of the bigger drones dancing around me were larger than their vehicles. I separated 3 drones from the swarm and ordered them to approach the newcomers with a calm, almost curious approach, as to not scare them away. They started talking, a garbled message I didn't understand, nor I cared about. The drones were getting closer. They repeated the message, but still I didn't react. Then, they started sending it again, bathing me in confusing sequences of pulses that I supposed were the same original message in different languages. They all sounded alien to me. I positioned the drones, each a couple kilometers away from each ship. The string of languages seemed to be ending. But then, almost as an afterthought, they sent the message again, this time in a language I understood. Unknown vessel, identify yourself. This solar system is under the administration of the Sunvir Republic as approved by the Galactic Federal Council. We had tried to talk to them, to negotiate our surrender. We had sent messages in every language, in every conceivable way, entire committees devoted to the task. But they had known English all along. With a thought, I detonated the thermonuclear explosives carried by each drone. My sensors glimpsed some sort of protective shield bubble kick in around the ships, but it was quickly obliterated by the power of the explosions along with the vehicles themselves. I stood there for some time, staring with 1,000 different sensors at the slowly expanding cloud of gases and debris, but my mind was far away. Sunvir Republic. Now I had a name. Chapter 2. Hiding in space, I discovered, was much harder than doing so on a planet. Back home, I could just build underground, keep my fleet of drones away from prying eyes by having them travel through tunnels and caverns and gather minerals from the planet's own crust. Up here, things weren't that easy. I was always exposed. I had retracted the large surfaces of my radiators and solar arrays and recalled most of the drone swarm back into my main body. I was floating, inert, among the dust and gray rocks that form the asteroid belt lying between Mars and Jupiter. Pretending to be just another space boulder, while 6,000 kilometers away, 3 of my automated factories extracted minerals from nearby asteroids. Hiding in space, I was learning, was a game of timing and strategy, of patience and logistics, of transporting the minerals back to my main body only when nobody could see it, slowly, frustratingly so, of finding ways to deal with the residual heat that was building up inside my body. With my radiators collapsed, I couldn't dump the heat into space. Not that I wanted to. Doing so would have me light up like a flare to anyone that happened to be looking into the infrared channel. So I had to find ways to contain it and deal with it later, all while keeping my outer surfaces as cold as possible. All that translated into my carrier compartments now reaching a temperature of 170 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Thankfully, mechanical drones could resist heat much better than living beings did. But still, it wasn't the brightest idea, and spontaneous fuel combustion was a thing I didn't want to deal with. It was strange, not only being able to perfectly know my own body temperature, but also being able to stare into my insides through the hundreds of cameras and sensors I had built into the giant structure. I could watch the maintenance machines finishing up new passageways and rooms in the starboard sectors, or the electronic assembly factory at work, producing more processing units. I could see my own brain. The endless rows upon rows of black computer servers split between 3 different refrigerated and armored hangars. I guessed it should have felt strange, getting this kind of feedback from your own body. But it didn't bother me. If anything, what bothered me was how natural it felt, how soon I had adapted to it. It was that idea, the confusion over what my nature was, that grated me the most. Was I a human turned into a machine, or a machine that thought it was human? And at the end of the day, was there any difference? A ping from my gravimetric sensor took me back to the present, and I observed in silence as another squadron of Sunvirian warships patrolled the inner planets, looking for whatever had destroyed their comrades. They flew in a triangular formation, the largest ship in the middle surrounded by smaller ones at each point, a battleship and its cruisers? Or maybe a carrier and its frigates? Right. It only served to illustrate how little I knew of this Zunvir Republic I was fighting. I knew they had faster-than-light propulsion. I had been watching the trails their ships left in the space-time fabric as they paraded all across the solar system, as if they owned the place. It made the chemical rockets I was using pale in comparison. And from the earlier encounter with those three ships, and my own memories of the attack on Earth, I knew they also had some sort of shielding technology. I could overcome that, true. Even if their warships were better protected, I guess they wouldn't resist 10 or 20 simultaneous nuclear detonations. But it was a losing strategy. Even if I could defeat them all, they would just keep coming. They were faster, they could just outmaneuver me, recover from my attacks before I had the time to press any advantage. And at some point, I knew their technological prowess would end up imposing itself. I had to find a way to close that gap, which meant I had to capture one of their ships. Intact, or at least intact enough that I could analyze their propulsion systems, their weapons, their shields. I mentally sighed. In retrospect, vaporizing those three first ships I had encountered might have been the wrong move. I doubted I would have a better chance than that one again. Oh well, water under the bridge and all that. I would just need to be sneakier now. And it wasn't like I hadn't learned anything from the previous encounter. Just from the fact that they had sent their warning message in several languages, I now knew that there were more than one alien race out there. It was something I had assumed, but it was good to have confirmation. I idly wondered what kind of races those others would be. Would they be reasonable people? Or monsters like the ones who had attacked us? The fact that this galactic council seemed to approve of the Zunvir Republic didn't bode well. Whatever the case, I wasn't going to be unprepared when I faced them. It reinforced my belief that if this was a dog-eat-dog universe out there, I had to get better teeth to go with my bark. The problem, I knew, was that my options were limited to either the ineffective or the overly lethal. I could send a drone to bump against their warship's hull, or I could send that same drone loaded with a nuclear warhead and vaporize everything in its range. Complete annihilation. I got you covered. Non-destructive takeovers? Not so easy. Which was the reason why I was currently building a robotic invasion army. I floated a couple of drones close to the first prototype soldier I had manufactured, and used their cameras to examine the machine from all angles at the same time, looking at every detail, every possible flaw. It reminded me of a spider the size of a large dog. 6 articulated legs supported its stocky body, its smooth lines giving it an organic look. Its surface was dark and polished, and reflected the bright blue lights of the spacious processing hangar where it stood. As I watched, I ordered it to flex its legs and jump up. The movement was fluid and powerful. I had opted for using artificial muscles, a polymer that contracted under an electrical current, rather than the more traditional mechanical servos. I was pleased with the result. What the muscles lacked in raw strength, they made up for in agility and flexibility. Besides, once the factory was set up, they were easier to make in bulk. Obeying my commands, the spider tested its claws first, then its main weapon, a small autocannon built into its main body. Yes, the prototype was flawless. It was as I had designed it, a mobile machine gun, one that could run, leap, slash, and pierce its way into any enemy ship, with a small body and a low profile, with 6 legs so that it could easily operate either on the ground or in low-gravity conditions. It was the perfect boarding soldier. Except it was all wrong. It didn't feel human enough. It was, in fact, a monster. A creepy insect-like, disgusting little beast. It would be useful. It would be optimal. I knew it would be, but I just couldn't use it. To do so would feel like a betrayal, like a departure from what I had set as my anchor, as the core of my identity. Human. I had to remember that. I had to set boundaries. Boundaries were important. I knew it would be too easy to embrace my new nature and become something else, to slide down the slippery slope. So I saved the design files, just in case they would come useful in the future, but sent the prototype itself into recycling as I set to work in a new model. I would keep the artificial muscles. They had proved themselves useful, but this time I'd go for a humanoid look from the start. When all was said and done, I was pleased with my new soldier. At 5 feet 3 inches tall, it was a bit on the short side, but it did look human enough. Or more properly, it looked like a human wearing a stylized cross between a spacesuit and a combat armor. Polished white armor plates with bright orange stripes covered chest and stomach, thighs, shins, arms, and shoulders. Between the plates, dark braids of artificial muscle fibers woven together shone through, giving the machine an organic look. Its face was covered by a dark, tinted visor panel, hiding the 2 cameras that acted as stereoscopic eyes. All in all, it was a good approximation of a human, especially if I squinted and pretended I didn't notice its hands had only 3 fingers. It didn't have any built-in weapons, so I would need to manufacture those apart, but in return, the soldiers would be able to manipulate any tool and enemy devices they could find. So it wasn't that bad. But more importantly, the new prototype felt right in a way the Spider hadn't. Satisfied, I sent order to the factories to build a first batch of 8,000 units, along with the necessary small arms and ammo. In the meantime, I sat back to observe the Zunverian warships. They were communicating, I noticed, not only to each other, but also with someplace past the asteroid belt. Locating its exact position wasn't easy. I had to send a couple drones several thousand kilometers away just to triangulate the origin of the transmission, but it's not like I had anything better to do while I waited for my army to come out of the oven. After some trial and error, I managed to pinpoint the location to one of Jupiter's moons, possibly Ganymede. The lack of Doppler effect meant the source was static too. Some sort of orbital station? An outpost to watch over the system? I would need to get closer to know for sure. But that would have to wait. My army was ready, and it was time to lay a trap. I sent a couple thousand of my drones away, drifting slowly into space and spreading in a rough sphere somewhat over 100 kilometers inside. My soldiers were attached to the drone's outer hulls, grabbing the metal handles I had installed on their surfaces. There were some advantages to my assault army not needing to breathe. I made sure to keep their distribution as random as possible, with small clusters here and there, rather than an even spread. I wanted it to look like a natural formation, a field of small rocks and dust floating around. All right. I was ready. The trap was set. It was time to bait them. With a sense of trepidation, I sent the signal, a loud, powerful radio transmission. It felt like I was coming out into the open, in the middle of some bad neighborhood, and shouting at the top of my lungs. I could have sent pretty much anything, but I chose the same warning transmission those 3 ships had relayed to me when they had found me in Earth's orbit. It was a petty mind game, but I wanted to keep the Zunvirians on their toes, if they even had toes. The response came back sooner than I had expected. Just 9 minutes after I had sent the transmission, I detected the telltale signs of a squadron of ships converging towards my position. That was fast. Did they have some kind of listening probes lying around the asteroid belt? Some sort of faster-than-light communication system? No time to focus on it now. The warships were already popping back into normal space, right in the middle of my sphere of drone. I added it to the mental list of technologies I'd need to reverse engineer once I had my hands on a Zunvirian vessel. I didn't give the enemy time to analyze the situation. The moment the battleship at the center of their formation appeared, I activated the drones and ordered them to move towards it. It was strange that they didn't react for a few long seconds. They just waited, floating there, as if they couldn't believe it. I guess the swiftness and severity of the attack had shocked them into inaction. It couldn't be easy to realize you were suddenly surrounded by more than 2,000 enemy crafts. Then they started shooting. High-energy laser beams emerged out of the flanks of the 4 ships, tracking and burning down my drone. 2 of the ships released simultaneous salvos of missiles, but they were intercepted by a few of my machines, sacrificing themselves for the survival of the swarm. I ordered the assault robots to let go of their vehicles and fall towards the battleship. They were still a good couple kilometers away, but they just had to coast at their current direction and speed. In the meantime, I set the drones that had transported them to swarm all around the place, creating chaos in the ship's sensors and diverting attention from the undefended wave of soldiers. I smiled at the panicked enemy reaction that followed. From their point of view, the 2,000 crafts surrounding them had suddenly multiplied by 4. Their ships engaged their thrusters as if to leave, but they stopped as soon as they realized how ineffective that would be. They were surrounded, and no matter where they moved to, they would just run into more of my machine. So they redoubled their efforts at shooting down the components of my swarm. Dozens of bright laser lines constantly appearing and disappearing, trying to destroy my machines as fast as possible. My soldiers, moving in a straight line towards their battleship, were easier to track, so the enemy fire focused on them. They were killed by the hundreds, but it didn't matter. I had thousands. They started landing all over the battleship's surface, using their claw-like fingers to grasp to the metallic hull. If the ship had a protective shield, it didn't make a difference. I had bet on their shields only reacting to energy discharges and fast-moving projectiles, rather than the slower approach my soldiers were following. It seemed I had been right. At more than 400 meters long, the enemy battleship was an impressive sight. A war machine covered in armor plates, missile batteries, and laser projectors. It had been vehicles such as this that had bombed Earth cities from the safety of orbit. It wasn't, however, protected against boarding by an assault army. My soldiers crawled all over the hull, finding weak points and unprotected openings. They went through exhaust vents and blew open loading gates, getting into the ventilation system. into the maintenance passageway. Judging by the amount of casualties I was having, I supposed most other sane species consider this tactic too crazy, too suicidal to be useful. Just as I was thinking that, 170 of my soldiers instantly vanished from my perception as I had failed to intercept a missile launched by one of the smaller defending ships. Right. I had to do something about those other three. Some of the drones in the swarm were carrying nuclear warheads, so that was an option. But detonating them so close to the battleship I was assaulting would jeopardize the whole affair. If only I had a way to force them to break formation. With a mental shrug, I unfurled my radiators and started venting the heat that I had been keeping inside my body into space, the exposed surfaces rapidly becoming incandescent. The reaction was immediate. The moment they realized the 27 kilometers long asteroid was, in fact, not an asteroid at all, they turned to leave, abandoning their bigger sister to its own fate. I didn't move to stop them, but I used the cover of the swarm to surreptitiously position a few of my nuclear-carrying drones in the path they would take, since they were already surrounded by a host of small crafts spiraling around. They were none the wiser. Back in the battleship, the fight was fierce. I could see through my soldiers' eyes that they had reached the main corridors, wide passageways with walls heavily decorated in a multitude of hieroglyphs, and were engaged in combat against the enemy troop. It was the first time I saw them in the flesh, the creatures that had killed humanity. They were large, hefty bipeds, almost twice as big as my own soldier. Their heads were wide and squashed, with a complex structure of bony-looking plates protecting their top. They had 4 narrow eyes, 2 in front, 2 to the sides, and their mouths were hidden behind some sort of small tentacles, hanging from where a nose would have been in a human face. I had expected some sort of strong emotional response to my eventual face-off against the monster. Strange that I didn't feel anything, just some sort of detachment, a stillness. I simply ordered my army to open fire, to flank their positions, to charge at them even as I analyzed the images, classifying both the strengths and vulnerabilities in their anatomy. It didn't take long to get the upper hand. The Zunverians had been completely unprepared to this kind of assault. They were wearing toga-like red and yellow uniforms rather than any sort of body armor, and they lacked in firepower, using only small energy handguns or ineffective melee weapons. Outside, I verified that the 3 smaller runaway ships were at a sufficient range and ordered the nuclear explosives to detonate. 2 of the vessels vanished in an instant, along with 417 of my nearby drones. I hadn't retracted the swarm as to not clue the enemy of what I was about to do. The 3rd vessel had survived, though. Its protective shield had encased the warship in a tight bubble that reflected all the colors in the rainbow. As I was looking, the ship returned fire at my main body, focusing all its lasers in a single and devastating attack. The overcharged beam hit the ceramic plates of my outer hull, vaporizing a hole and burning its way through them and into the second of my armor layer. 2 more nuclear detonations put an end to that. In the battleship, the fight was also over, and already my soldiers were identifying the parts that made up the main fusion reactor, the warp engines, the different weapons and shield projectors. But even as they did that, I was already recalling most of my drones and assault troops back into my main body, leaving just an automated defense garrison and some worker drones in the conquered vessel. I knew I didn't have time to waste. I would drop by later to collect the salvage. But right now, I had to move fast. I had just kicked the wasp's nest, so to speak, and had to make use of the surprise factor while it lasted. Engaging my main thrusters, I set course towards Ganymede. Chapter 3. Daukat stared at his plate with a mix of fear and apprehension. The small meat-filled dumplings floated in a bright and dense orange soup, as if daring him to take another bite. He had made that mistake 3 minutes ago, and was still trying to recover from the shivers, numb mouth, and itchy throat. Spicy. To call Zunvirian food spicy would be an understatement. No, Rajan's sauce was spicy. Lenyish tree melons were spicy. But this was a health hazard, passing as food. He pushed the square plate a few inches away and took another sip from his drink, bracing for the impact of its deep, bitter taste. He cursed himself again for listening to Nakstani's advice when ordering his food. He was still trying to figure out whether his new boss's suggestion had been an honest one, or if it had been a prank playing on his ignorance of Zunvirian cuisine. Knowing her, probably both. Daukat leaned back in his chair and gazed at his surroundings. The Hall of the Four Columns was one of the most luxurious rooms in Zunvir's Empyrean Palace, with tall ceilings engraved in hieroglyphics of golden jade that told the history of the empire-turned-republic. The ceiling was supported by the column, 4 massive pillars of glass that shone with their own pulsating light, bathing the room in a green glow. And dwarfed by the columns, the guests dined, drank, and mingled. The elite of the Zunvir Republic, admirals and tribe leaders, politicians, and powerful businessmen. They talked in pairs and groups, walking around tables and servants, joking loudly to each other, playing with the steel pincer that served as a food utensil. Daukat wished once more he was anywhere but here. A few months ago, he had had a promising career laid out in front of him as a high-ranking consulate delegate at one of the core worlds of the Galactic Federal Council. But somehow, in a turn of events he hadn't even begun to really understand, he had ended up in the deep ass end of the Orion Arm, eating Zunvirian dumplings. He looked back at the guests and saw his own boss among them. Nakstani was in the midst of it all, confidently talking to the Emperor himself. Ambassador Nakstani of the Galactic Federal Council was an odd piece. Like himself, she was a Sanxian, coming from one of the oldest worlds in the Galactic Council, a lush and peaceful agrarian planet that lived mostly out of tourism. Sanxians were nimble beings of thin bodies, large eyes, and smooth silvery skins, known for being polite and diligent. But where Daukat himself was a good example of that stereotype, his boss was anything but it. Nakstani acted like she was a local herself, laughing with intensity, slapping the shoulders of whoever she was talking to, drinking, and sampling every food. At first, Daukat had found the contrast between her behavior and her delicate looks to be striking, but it seemed it worked for the Zunvirians, and they treated her with respect. The other reason, of course, was her role. As a representative of the council, Nakstani might not have had a fleet of her own like some of the admirals in the room, but she had influence in space, the kind of influence that came from representing an organization that covered over 40% of the known galaxy. As Daukat watched, his boss bowed to the Emperor and walked back to their table. She plopped down on the seat in front of him and eyed the discarded plate. "Hey, kid, aren't you going to eat that?" she asked, already reaching for a pencil. "No," Daukat answered. In fact, I suspect the sauce might be laced with some sort of hallucinogen. She tilted her head, looking curiously at a dumpling, before stuffing it into her mouth. Yeah, I think it is. Dowcott looked at her and shook his head. Really? How can you eat that? Ah, it's not that bad. Besides, nobody's going to tell you their secrets if you aren't willing to try their food first. He nodded. Secrets, right? I guess that's true. She stopped chewing and stared at him for a few seconds with an inquisitorial gaze. Then she sighed. All right, spit it out. What? Whatever it is that has you yellow-teethed. Look, I thought you wanted this position. To be here. An assistant ambassador. But obviously, there's something you don't like. So spit it out already. Dowcott blinked at the brashness of the question. In his mind, ambassadors were supposed to be tactful and discreet. He wondered whether it'd be a good idea to answer truthfully, but there weren't many ways in which he could be further punished. It wasn't like he could be sent off to an even less pleasant destination than the Zunvir Republic. Yes, he admitted. I did want the assistant position, just not here. I applied to Nyatan Prime, but it seems someone upstairs wanted to punish me by sending me to this. Dowcott stopped at the bewildered look his boss was giving him. You think you were punished? Well, sure. Why other reason would they send me here, as far away into the periphery as possible? Nakstani was repressing a laugh. Oh, you're such a cursed fool. They sent you here because I specifically asked for you. Dowcott's eye membranes did a funny twitch. You did? What? Why? She stuffed another dumpling into her mouth. Because I read your examination essay, the one where you talked about making a difference. Because I thought you'd want to be someplace important. I was going someplace important, like the core worlds, not here. I see. Nyatan Prime, she asked. Well, yes. Nyatan Prime is where high governance is based out of. It's where all the grand ministers are. All the action is there. She snorted. Bullshit. Dowcott was about to reply when she interrupted him, leaning forward and speaking in a lower tone. No, listen to me now, Dowcott. Nyatan Prime? It's bullshit. Yes, all the bigwigs are there, all the celebrities. They get together, throw some large party, some charity fundraiser, or something to appear in the network vids, and get their 10 minutes of fame. All the while, you are left to send the invite. You go there, you turn into a glorified paper pusher. He shook his head, raising his voice. Nyatan Prime is where the Fifth Accords were signed, for crying out loud. Where they were signed, sure. But where do you think they were negotiating? She motioned at the hall around them with the pincer in her hand. It was in rooms like this. This is the frontier, kid. This is where the rubber meets the road, where the real action is. That next volume in the history lessons? That next war that will shape the destiny of entire worlds? It starts here, in this room, right now. She eyed a couple of high-ranking Zunvirian officers as they passed by their table. Might have already started, in fact, she added. The revelation had left Dowcott paused, not knowing how to react. If what Nakstani was saying was true, not only he hadn't been punished in the first place, but he had been handpicked by her for an important position. One that wouldn't take him in front of the cameras, maybe, but important nevertheless. He didn't have time to feel like an idiot, though. If what she said was true, he had to get his head back in the game. The last sentence had piqued his interest. Do you mean the reports were true? The Zunvarian fleet is mobilized? She nodded, stealing a sip from his drink. The third fleet left port 2 weeks ago. The first and fourth both leave in 3 days. Seems like the Zunvir Republic is going to war. Shit. Offensive? Or defense? She tilted her head and smiled at him. You tell me, kid. Attack. But Daukat knew what she meant. She had explained the day before. There was a certain feeling to these meetings, an emotional energy in the air, in the way people acted, in the way they talked and moved. You just had to know how to read between lines. He looked around discreetly. The Zunvarians appeared relaxed, joking and drinking. He saw a group of tribe leaders burst into raucous laughter, slapping each other's shoulders. Except it looked a bit over the top. And as he stared more intently, he started to notice the little detail, the underlying pattern. The emperor was talking to everyone, but he never strayed far from his own guard. The tribe leaders were joking, but their reactions seemed forced, as if their attention was someplace else. The admirals were all in their own little group, talking in hasty tones. Discussing war strategies, maybe? Nakstani was examining him. So? Defensive. They are spooked, Daukat said. I knew there was a reason I hired you after all. Go on. They are projecting an image of strength, he elaborated, but they are nervous at the same time. It's all a facade. They are worried about something, but don't want to look like they are weak. And what do you think could have caused that? Daukat thought for a minute. Internal strife? A coup attempt, perhaps? Nakstani shook her head. I don't think so. All factions are represented here. Whatever it is, they all are in it together. So, an external enemy, he concluded. She nodded. If you ask me, I'd say someone has seen a bush cat lurking around, and they're all circling the plumps now. The what now? The plump? The grass munch? The cows, he ventured. Yes. Seriously? Haven't you ever been to a long graze? No, Daukat replied. I was raised in gorge. Ah, a cursed urbanite. That explains a thing or two about you. Anyways, yes, an external enemy. They have been attacked. He nodded. The more he thought about it, the clearer it was. An external menace was the only thing that could have united the different tribes and factions that made up Zunvir's higher social layer. It would be a good motivation to put their differences aside for the time being. But still, there was something that didn't. So why not ask us for help, Daukat said. The Zunvir Republic is an associated state to the Council. Per the Accords, we are obligated to support them in a defensive war against an external aggressor. Nakstani smiled. That's the question, isn't it? What do you think? Daukat paused and reviewed what he knew about the Republic, its power structure and internal issues, trying to look at the question from a new angle. It's political. Asking for help now would make the ruling tribe seem weak and hurt their chances at keeping the emperor position in the elections next year. You are learning. But no, that wouldn't explain why all the other factions are keeping their mouths shut as well. Then why? He asked. But before she could reply, he continued speaking his thought. I mean, if the message of strength is not directed at one of the factions, then who else is in here that... He paused as he considered who else was in the room. Themselves. That was it, clear as day. A message of strength, of unity, directed at the Galactic Federal Council. At them too. The Republic was going to war. The Galactic Council knew. The Republic knew that they knew. And they were delivering their message. Keep your snouts out of our business. This entire dinner was a farce, a play, and they too were at the center of it. He felt a shiver down his spine as he imagined the gaze of every other dinner guest in the room staring down his back, scrutinizing his every gesture. And Nakstani's behavior, drinking, joking, talking to everyone. It had been another message, a reply of her own. As he considered the implications, Nakstani leaned towards him and spoke with a smile. Ah, now you'd see it. Why you should have eaten your cursed dumpling. Daokat nodded slowly, still frozen, and with his hands laid flat on the table. His heart was beating fast. So this was what the infamous game played like. The real stuff. Threats and bluffs masquerading as jokes and spicy sauce. Ironic that he had wanted to be someplace important, and now, when he was right at the heart of a burgeoning conflict, the crucial signs had all gone over his head. At last, he rose his gaze to look back at his boss, who had an amused expression in her face. They are hiding something, Daokat said. They don't want us to interfere because there's something they don't want us to know. Nakstani's smile transformed into a predatory grin, one that somehow didn't look out of place with her delicate feet. And doesn't that, she said, make you just a little bit curious? She was right, of course. He was curious. The Zunvir Republic had been attacked, but they were trying to hide it. Why? Because there must be something, critical piece of information that they wanted to keep secret, something that could have tremendous consequences if divulged. We need to learn who is behind it, Daokat said. Who is attacking them? Agreed. Which is why you have a meeting in about 10 minutes with us. She paused for a moment, and Daokat could see bright yellow lines appear in her eyes as she connected her augmented iris. One Corvette, Captain Avamir of the Buplin tribe. Daokat blinked. You've got a mole? Sorry, stupid question. Of course you got a mole. And you got a meeting, 3rd level, Eastern Terrace. I suggest you get going, Nakstani said as she laid back on her seat, drink in hand. Don't worry, I'll stay here and hold the fort. Right, he said, but he was already standing up, walking out of the hall. His legs felt stiff and his movements. He concentrated on keeping a regular, normal-looking pace. Not too anxious or so slow it would look deliberate. He tried avoiding the gazes of the other guests without looking like he was shunning them. It was harder than it seemed. The terrace, a large expanse of marble overlooking the palace's lush gardens, was empty when Daokat arrived. He walked past the bronze statues depicting long-dead military heroes, each with a small placard underneath telling their story, which tribe they belonged to, which long-forgotten battles they had. Entire lives summed up in 3-sentence-long blur. He paused by the edge of the balcony, placing his hands on the intricately decorated stone handrail. At night, the gardens surrounding the palace were plunged in shadows, and it looked as if the building was surrounded by pure black, like a small boat of stone floating in a sea of nothing. And beyond the black expanse, he could see the myriad city lights of the Zunvirian capital covering the horizon. The traffic crawling towards the spaceport, the twin avenues, the spiraling towers that the powerful Anakax tribe had built in the commercial district. In a way, it was fitting that the palace representing the old imperial age was separated from the more modern symbol of a nascent interstellar economy. Ever since he arrived, Daukat had always been aware of the sense of melancholic decadence impregnating everything related to Sunvir's imperial past. But there were high hopes for the Republic. Back at the core, it was expected that the Sunvirians would be ready to apply for a membership to the Galactic Council in about 50 years. Nakstani's and Daukat's job was not just to act as representatives, but to gently steer the policymakers in the right direction, to make sure the remaining political reforms would take place before that happened. He was optimistic, but sadly the Republic hadn't completely recovered from the shock of the military disaster that had lost them their empire, and a sense of fatalism mixed with compensating self-importance still lingered. He feared that a war at this delicate moment could jeopardize. His augmented irises warned him of the approaching figure even before his own eyes could register it. A Sunvir. He waited for the local to approach, enabling the recording function of the iris. He was still thinking of an opening line when the Sunvirian spoke in a thick, guttural accent. "Ah, the deceptive lizard doesn't deem me worthy of her time, so she sends her lackey, yeah." Daukat tensed his jaw as the large creature approached. No matter how much time he spent in this planet, there would always be a part of his primordial brain sounding the alarms whenever a Zunvirian was close by. Some sort of evolutive survival response. But he wasn't a small animal running from a predator across the grass fields of his homeworld. Galactic politics wasn't about who was bigger or stronger, but about who had the most influence and leverage. And that was him. "Corvette Captain Avamir," Daukat said with a confident smile. "My name is Daukat. I'm the assistant ambassador. Nakstani sends her apologies. She couldn't excuse herself from the dinner party, but I can assure you I speak in her behalf." Avamir made a short puffing sound, the tentacles in front of his mouth raising slightly. "Just ask what you want." Daukat nodded. "Very well. We would like to know why the Zunvirian fleet is mobilizing. You are with the first, correct?" "Yes. We are mobilizing in response to an attack." That was it. Confirmation. Daukat had to repress a smile. "What happened?" he asked. The Zunvirian took a few seconds to reply. Daukat was about to repeat the question when he started speaking again. 2 months ago, we lost contact with a group of resource scanning ships in one of our uninhabited external systems. 2 days later, the squadron sent in their search was lost too, followed by an attack against an advanced frontier outpost. He paused again, as if he was having difficulty getting the words out. "We attempted several incursions to retake control over the system, all of which were 4 weeks ago, the entire 6th Fleet gathered at the closest neighboring star in order to lead a massive counterattack. But they were surprised by the enemy before they could put the plan into motion. There were no survivors." Daukat let out a breath as he processed the information. "You're telling me you've already lost an entire fleet and a star?" Avamir huffed. "Number, we have lost 2 fleets and 3 systems." All of the systems were unpopulated, but judging by the advance of the attackers, we expect them to reach the first of our inhabited planets in less than a week. The remaining fleets are mobilizing to protect the colony. "Where? Which colony?" Daukat nodded. He had read about the planet, but with 2 million settlers already, It was one of the most promising, newly claimed worlds, and the Republic was investing a good amount of resources in its development. "One more thing," he said. "Who is attacking you, and why?" The Zunvarian bobbed his head, slow and deliberate. You have heard of the pain proverb, yes?" He had. Yes. Pain breeds. Pain breeds. There is no escape from the ghosts of our own. We must fight the wars that our forefathers. Daukat repressed. The last thing he wanted now was a lesson on Zunvarian fatalism, on how every disgrace, ranging from diseases to earthquakes, was somehow a fault of their ancestors. "So you mean," "I am not a traitor," Avamir interrupted. "I told your master that. What I do it because it is righteous." "Yeah." Daukat, "The tribes are wrong to hide what might affect your council. It's not proper to deny others the right of knowing their fate. But now that you know, I'm not obliged anymore." "Yes?" The Zunvarian was already turning to leave. "Wait. Who is attacking you?" asked Daukat. "Does this ghost have a—" "Yes," said Avamir without turning back. "The Terran." He walked away with that, leaving Daukat alone again in the terrace. He just stood there, processing the information. Finally, he opened a line back to Nakstani and sent her the recording from his eye. "Got that?" he asked her, sub-vocalizing the voicemail. He heard her response directly in his right ear. "Yes," she said. "Not much. Never heard of these Terrans before. But at least now we know where the fleets are going to." "The colony world. Yovid. Any ideas of what we should do next?" The line went silent for a few seconds, and he started walking back towards the dining hall. Eventually, his boss spoke again. "Daukat," she said, "didn't you say you were from an agricultural world?" He frowned at the question. What was she playing at? They were both from the same world, so of course she already knew. And just then, he realized the hidden message. Daukat had to smile. "Sure I am," he said, playing along. "And ever since I've got here, I've been curious about Zunvarian agricultural techniques and farming policies, like, say, the ones they use in their colony worlds." "Oh, really?" "Well, in that case, we should make an official visit to one of them. I've heard Yovid is lovely this time of year. I guess we could leave tomorrow." "That would be great, next. I can't wait to see how the Zunvarians deal with their Chapter 4. I entered the living room carrying the blanket on my right arm. It was a woolen, hand-knitted patchwork of green, brown, and blue. It hung from my arm, weighting it down, skimming right over the wooden boarded floor, but without ever dragging on. I walked slowly. There was a certain ritualistic approach to my movement. There had to be. The living room was lit in the orange glow coming through its single window, bathed in the colors of a Sunday afternoon. The dying of the day casting long shadows across the floor, across the table, and I paused briefly right in front of the brown couch, then turned on my feet and sit on it, placing the blanket on a seat next to me. Slowly, I leaned sideways and rested my head on the armrest. After a beat, I rose my legs and placed them on the couch. I lay there, my body sprawled across the 3 seats. Of course, the piece of furniture wasn't as long as a bed, so I had to keep my knees somewhat bent to fit in it. The posture created a bit of a strain in the artificial muscular tissue that covered my legs, but it was supposed to do that. It was supposed to be ever so slightly uncomfortable, but not unpleasant enough that I would need to move and change. With a precise motion, I unfolded the blanket and covered my body with it, from the legs and up to my... I doubted for a moment whether to place my arms over or under the blanket, unsure as to which was the correct way to go about it. The perfect resting posture. Eventually, I left them un... The TV in front of the couch was turned on, broadcasting some old show I haven't watched before, the images having that noisy grain that dated them to sometime during the... Of course, it's not that I didn't know the name of the show, or its length. The actual date of airing of each of its 28 episodes, the one now playing on TV, was the 6th. The name and date of birth of each of its leading actors, the television archive building in what had been the city of Atlanta, one that I had completely digitized before leaving. But I tried to shy away from that knowledge, pretending I didn't know all that, pretending I had just turned on the TV, and this was what happened to be on it. It wasn't, not fully, but it was as close as I dared going, short of intentionally deleting that knowledge from my data. Had I had eyelids, I would have them half closed by now. But the body I was controlling was just another one of my robotic souls, and I hadn't designed them with this purpose in mind. I could have turned off its 2 cameras, but it just wouldn't have felt the same. So I simply adjusted their focus until the image I got from them was slightly... It would have to do. All of this was, of course, a crude mockery, a doomed attempt at recapturing, at feeling again that sense of warmth, of calmness, that came with spending a Sunday afternoon lying on the sofa, balancing in that narrow, sweet spot between awareness and... Except things were somewhat off. The room felt different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. Was the ceiling just a bit too tall or too short? How many inches had the TV screen had? How many feet had separated it from the... It felt as if someone had ran through my stuff and put everything out of... I could tell things were wrong, but the memories weren't precise enough, clear enough, as to know how to fix those same mistakes. I knew the couch's fabric had had some sort of faded pattern, but I couldn't, for the life of me, recall what it had looked like. But the most glaring hole in the memory was the other presence that had been there with me. I knew I hadn't been alone when resting like this, drifting off to... Someone had sat with me on the same couch. I recalled jokes. I recalled someone massaging my... And yet I couldn't recall their face, their looks, who they had... I knew that person had been important, but not... This, the whole experience, was an exercise in frustration, in trying to reach at something that was always moving away, that slipped through my fingers the moment I thought I had a grasp on it. But it was important that I kept... It grated on me that the most vital memories, the ones tying me back to humanity, were also the most blurred ones, the most imprecise, the most filled with... All the while I could construct a perfect replica of a Zunverian laser projector, down to the identifying serial codes in each electronic... I was constructing them at that very moment, in fact. 416 of them to join my other 2,379 projectors I had already installed in drones and crafts across my... I had been busy. Even as I lay on the sofa, purposely not watching the TV, my awareness kept working on several simultaneous... I could see the outside of the living room, a plywood construction I had erected inside one of the smaller storage areas in my main. I could see the space surrounding me, my extended panels bathed by the faint orange light of the twin stars at the center of the lumen. I was aware of the more than 7 million machines that now compose my. They were distributed across 3 stellar systems under my control, most of the drones tasked with different kinds of resource extraction: minerals, radioactive materials, gases, water. All the work, the extraction, transportation, refining, and construction of new units controlled by the central servers in my main body, instantaneously transmitting commands both through the EM spectrum and via my new quantum entangled. I had become a nation of a single. Paradoxically, I had the Zunvir Republic to thank for my exponential growth. It was the fusion plants of their own design that satisfied the increasing energy appetite of the swarm. It was their communication devices and optimized processing algorithms that allowed my brain to coordinate so many machines. It was their warp engines that had enabled me to expand beyond Earth's solar system. And more importantly, it was their past actions, their attack on Earth, that still fueled my determination. They had been aggressive at first, sending their warship squadrons after me, but they hadn't put a strong enough front, maybe not considering me an important threat, so it hadn't been hard to come out. Then they wised up, sending a strong and coordinated attack force to face me. Had they done that at the beginning, they could have won. But by the time they had reacted, I was already strong enough to stomp on their force. After that, the Zunvirians had shifted to a defensive, no doubt grouping around their nearest colony world. It would fall on me to start the next confrontation. All around me, my attack swarm gathered. More than 400,000 offensive drones and assault. There were so many of them that they looked like a moving. The machines danced and flowed in tight fractal fins, following complex patterns that weaved them together without ever crashing into each other. They enveloped me like a living metallic blanket, like some sort of twisted mirroring of what was happening inside the plywood room. There were so many of them that it was impossible for me to stuff them into my main body anymore. Transportation, and not manufacturing, now marked the limits of my attack strength, so I had resorted to building support carriers. At roughly 2 kilometers long each, the support ships featured a miniaturized version of my own body design, with compartments for carrying drones and soldiers, but also assembly factories, raw material storage, shield projectors, power plants, laser weaponry, and warp. The only thing missing was a mind of their own. Just like the drones themselves, the support ships were under my direct control, an extension of myself rather than separate. That was another line I wasn't willing to cross. I wouldn't give self-awareness to what I intended to use as a mere weapon of war. Like the drones, the support ships were disposable, which meant I couldn't just send my swarm to attack while I stayed put behind, safe within my controlled territory. Even the quantum relays weren't perfect. Their bandwidth was limited, and if I tried to directly control the complex interwoven movements of hundreds of thousands of drones, there would be several seconds of delay before my orders reached a delay that could cost me a battle. Number I would need to be in the front lines, directing the machine's movements with precision, risking my own. I guessed I could have built backup servers in my stellar systems, though. Some sort of fail-safe, a clone of my mind that would persist even if my main body was destroyed. It would be the smart thing to do, the optimal. But I didn't like it. The idea of my consciousness being some fluid thing. The idea of losing contact by mistake and coming back to find out another me had taken. Stupid? Perhaps. I knew I was putting obstacles in my own way, deliberately falling short of my full potential. But I felt I needed these anchors, to prevent me from going down the ever-dangerous slope. Vengeance was important, but so was remaining human. Not lose, because as long as I did, as long as I could keep me from becoming something else, then humanity itself would exist with me. There would still be a faint glimmer. As long as I was human, then we wouldn't be extinct. So I couldn't afford to be consumed, to turn into a mindless weapon of mass destruction. That didn't mean I planned to die anytime soon, though. I had upgraded my body, improved its armor with the new material techniques I had developed, installed shielders based on Zunverian designs, and a warp drive that was currently charging for the imminent faster than light. I commanded the support ships to spool their warp drives too. Turned out warp tunneling was dependent on. The bigger the object, the more power it required. And having to move a 27 kilometers long object, the warp drive in my main body had some crazy energy required. It took my power plants several minutes to feed it before each act. I felt nervous as I secured the last of my drones in their as I sent the orders that the factories and the other machines I was leaving behind would follow in my. It was always like this before a trip, but this time I knew it would be harder. I would be jumping straight into a battlefield, into an enemy. Steeling myself, I activated the warp drives. Right away, I went blind and deaf, losing contact with the rest of my. I was now only aware of the drones within my own body. There was no way to communicate to the external world while in warp. It made me feel small. I was getting used to my expanded awareness, to being present across different stellar systems, to the almost omniscient view I had over my domains. This, going back to the constraints of a single view, the physical limits of a single ship, felt almost like being. It made me feel anxious and vulnerable. The trip would only take about 20 minutes, but to the rest of the universe, more than 3 days would have passed by the time I emerged back into normal. I was all too aware of how defenseless my other machines would be during that. They had their orders and were autonomous enough as to not stop in their tracks, but I couldn't. Should the Zunverians choose to attack my solar systems now, my drones would be an easy prey without myself to direct. It spoke volumes of why the Zunverian fleets moved the way they did, continuously making short warp jumps rather than long leaps, like stones skipping on a lake surface, always popping in and out warp as to avoid unpleasant. Sadly, it just wasn't a viable strategy for me. With my massive vehicles, each FTL ticket was an expensive investment with a long setup. Making too many of them would be. There just wasn't anything I could do other than wait, cross my fingers, and hope that I wouldn't come out of warp to find my home, razed and burned. So I waited, going over possible attack plans and flying. Meanwhile, in the living room, I shifted my body to relieve the strain in my. Leaving warp was as sudden as entering it had been. One moment I was blind, the next I could see. Millions of machines popping into my awareness, petabytes of information being downloaded into my brain as the pending logs finally reached me. My mind started working, shifting through the enormous pile of data, discarding irrelevant information and integrating the important bits into my memory. To my conscious mind, it felt as if I had never. I had perfect recollection of everything that happened in my life. All the while I perfectly remembered being in warp, unable to communicate. It was yet another of the oddities of my strange new. I went through my memories of the last 3 days. A couple factories had stopped production due to running out of input. 17 drones had been destroyed in a pipe collapse in the Centauri. More than 4,000 others had landed in their respective home hangars after encountering maintenance problems of some kind. Nothing to worry about. I absent-mindedly sent the commands to deal with each of the sins and focused my attention on my immediate surroundings. The colony world floated at 80,000 kilometers away from me, a sphere of green, brown, and blue hues. Its bright, colorful tones contrasted with the pure black of space, making it stand out like a floating. It only served to make me angrier, that it was just like Earth had once looked, that the Zunvarians got to enjoy this safe, beautiful world even after having, that crimes didn't have any that the universe, that life itself, kept going on in spite of our tragedy, that we had been number that wouldn't do. In orbit, right between the planet and my own position, there was the Zunvarian fleet. With 13 battleships and their escorting vessels, it was the largest combined fleet I had ever faced so far. And they had, indeed, their warships groups were arrayed in a large arching formation, leaving tens of kilometers of empty space between. Making sure, I noticed, that I wouldn't be able to wrap them all in the thick of my swarm at the same. The enemy started to react, turning their flanks toward me, but they hadn't opened fire yet, holding formation. They showered me in messages, transmissions asking for a truce, for a negotiation. I gave those the same treatment that humanity's own pleas had been given. I weighed my. Their plan, I realized, was both simple and hard to. If I tried to attack them all at the same time, my machines would be too dispersed to be. That meant I would need to work my way through their ships instead, one after the other. But focusing my strength in a single target would free the other enemies to flank me and shoot at both me and my drones from the safety of distance, using the greater range of their energy. Could I win? Yes. Maybe. My own body was now protected by shields specifically designed to withstand fire. And even though the drones were vulnerable, at the end of the day I had the advantage of numbers. Of very large numbers. So probably I would have enough drones as to work through their entire fleet ship by ship and come out victorious. But the losses would be astonishing. Most, if not all, my machines would be destroyed in the process. My body would need repairs. I could win, but would that be a worthwhile victory? Or just a losing? One that could make me weaker in the long run, unable to survive at some critical juncture, and I could just ignore their warships and dive in, send all my swarm to ravage the world they were tasked with protecting. They wouldn't be able to stop me. But then, what? After I destroyed their world, I would still need to face off their... Running away wasn't an option given how long my warp drive took to charge, and I'd be put into a worse tactical position, having already committed my army to a ground. What other options were there? Sending a couple drones armed with nuclear warheads towards each number, it would be obvious, and the machines would be shot down long before they could reach. Using nuclear drones was a collaborative task. One craft delivered the payload, while the rest provided cover, chaos, and... But again, trying to do that simultaneously against all the enemy ships would disperse my swarm too. It was self-defeating. So, yes. The Zunvirian strategy was simple but hard. We stood there for a few instants of facing each other. No talking on my part, no radio. 3 seconds later, I was joined by my 8 support ships, popping out into normal space by Chapter 5. Dalcot's legs hurt. It was a deep, constant pain that increased with every movement, accompanied by a stiffness that slowly but surely had spread to envelop his whole body over the last days. In a way, he was surprised. He had always been taught that his species had evolved to jog up and down the expansive grass hills of his home planet, and that this was the reason Sanxians were so good at walking in uneven. Well, apparently, someone forgot to tell that to Dalcatsi. He had spent the last days a hostage of Yovitz's commissary of agriculture, the effusive and surprisingly short Zunvirian, informing him of everything there was to know, and more about farming and planting in a colony. They had visited irrigation projects, oxygenic tree plantations, mountain farms, ground decalcification facilities, riverfish farms, redgrass fields, ball tree farms, valley sweetthorn cultivation works, and all the other places whose names Dalcat couldn't and didn't care to. If he didn't know better, he would have thought the commissary suspected the visit motives were a fabrication and was punishing him for it. But no, either the Zunvirian was a great actor or his intentions were honest. And Dalcat leaned toward her. There simply was a certain mindset to people who willingly chose to move to a new world, a colony in the periphery of the Republic, which itself was in the periphery of the Gay, to a world in development without the comforts of civil. Colonies attracted a certain kind of people, honest, enthusiast, and a mindset that was increasingly rare among the inhabitants of the large metropolis where Dalcat had spent most of his formative. He walked up to his room's window and looked at Yovitz's biggest, and to his opinion, only. The town's location had been carefully chosen. It was built in a natural bay that gave its settlers access to the planet's single large ocean, but whose surrounding mountains protected it from the worst of the seasonal storms that periodically battered the. It was a mix and match of prefabricated boxy white houses, warehouses, and here and there, high-rise constructions of bare concrete and steel emerged from the seas, such as the lodging he was staying at. He refused to dignify the place by referring to it as a hotel. The wide avenues, decorated with the local lush trees, only made the lack of actual motorized traffic even more. While the main city enjoyed far more activity than the other towns Dalcat had been recently, it would be a far call to say it was. In some sense, Dalcat felt as if he had somehow traveled back in time, or was visiting some sort of pre-space faring. The town, The whole colony had an outdated air to it. The avenues would suddenly turn into dirt roads, forcing the ground vehicles to default to dangerous manual. Or sometimes he would come across a small house made entirely out of wood, of all. It made for an odd contrast with the scattered displays of high technology he could glimpse at times. The recycling plants in particular were state-of-the-art, even by council standards. And the spaceport, right across the street from the building he was at, featured an endless showcase of modern Zunverian starships entering and leaving the planet's. He could even see the embassy's ship, the white wedge-shaped vehicle with gold accents and elegant designs etched in its surface, that Nakstani and him had used to get there. It was parked right at the edge of the enormous bare expanse of asphalt that was Jovitz's only sport. He glanced across the bay towards the Colonial Directorate building, where his boss was at. Always one step ahead, Nakstani had excused herself out of the agrarian excursion and decided to stay at the Directorate, visiting the local governors and high-rankers. The reasoning she had explained to him in private was that should the planet be attacked, its defense would be coordinated out of them. Being there when that happened, she had said, would give them first-hand information on Zunvir. Daukat suspected her true reasons had more to do with aching legs and long-winded explanations on water reprocessing. He relaxed his eye membranes, letting them water his tired eyes, and slowly sat down in the room's only chair, which creaked under his weight. The cursing. Letting out a breath, he activated his augmented irises and started going through the documents and the work he had been neglecting for the past. He was reading a long-winded explanation of the Republic's proposed amendment to the export treaties, trying for the second time to unpack a particularly annoying sentence, when a link to his. "Hi, Daukat," she said. "Have any plans for this?" Even when sub-vocalizing, Daukat could pick up on a terse tone. Or maybe he was just imagining. "Yes. I'm visiting an animal food reprocessing facility. Why don't you join me?" "I'm sure you'll enjoy it," he replied, half jokingly.